And we're back with the Dr. Joe Show with world-renowned thriller author Jon Land. Hey, John, Mark here. And I was talking off air with Dr. Joe about similarities with the fact I was listening to a podcast today, the Joe Rogan Experience. He was interviewing Quentin Tarantino. And you're speaking a lot of the same language, where Quentin was talking about how he formulates and the character directs where it's going. And for a non-writer, it seems very spiritual and metaphysical to hear that. You know, you sometimes hear the musicians say they're not really playing. It's the message is coming to them and letting they're just a conduit. Where do you how do you find the inspiration, and where do you begin the story in your mind? Do you storyboard it? Do you start at the beginning and let it go, or how do you do it?
First off, inspiration is a dangerous word.
Okay.
Because if you wait for inspiration, you know, you're not a professional. Professionals don't need to be inspired. They need to work. The work creates its own inspiration. And to be blunt, I think the inspiration for most writers comes from the same things that comes from everybody else. You got to pay the mortgage. You got to pay the bills.
Right.
You know, you've got to put food on the table. Just because I love what I do doesn't change the fact that I have to keep doing it in order to make a living, to support, you know, my lifestyle. I am a seat of the pants writer. I don't outline. I do have a general flow of where I'm going, but the best stuff I come up with, I don't know. I might know where I'm going, but I don't know how to get there. I don't know how I'm going to get there until I start writing. This is, you know, it's always been that way for me. And writers have to find their own way. They have to find their own path. Some writers are big. You mentioned storyboards. Some writers are huge outliners. Some screenwriters spend more time with their index cards than they do with the script itself. For me, it's about letting the story take me where it needs to go. Getting out of the way, as I said before. The story, I trust the story. I trust my characters. And Mark, if I'm surprised by something, if I don't know what's going to happen next, how can you possibly know what's going to happen next? And when I surprise myself, that's when I know I have a real shot at surprising the audience as well.
But how does that happen, that you become surprised by where your character has taken you?
Well, it's also where the story has taken me. And it often happens when I get to a point where I don't know what's going to happen next. And it's literally the old sleep on it thing, sleep on it or something of that sort. And then a light bulb goes off, and I went, oh, now I get where this is going. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. M. Night Shyamalan has written one incredible film, and he's also directed and written a lot of unwatchable films. In fact, M. Night Shyamalan's body of work, most of it is terrible, but The Sixth Sense is a classic. Mm-hmm. So how did it happen? And there was an interview I read with M. Night Shyamalan where he said he was setting out to write a story about a failed psychiatrist who works with a kid who imagines that he sees dead people, only to realize that he really does. He did not realize that the Bruce Willis psychiatrist character was dead until he was halfway through the script, when the light bulb went off and went, oh my God, now I get it. So out of this, oeuvre of, if you look at his general body of work, there's so much weakness in storytelling, so many poor characters. No offense, hey, but that's just how I feel. Whereas with The Sixth Sense, he struck incredible gold because he let the the story take him where it needed to go. He didn't write from the end back, which seems to be the case in a lot of his films, where he has this concept of an ending and he needs to write to it to get to it, and it never seems to work. Because by the time we get to the ending, we've either already figured it out or we don't care anymore. So I think when you let the story direct where you're going, when you let the characters tell you, and one of my favorite books, for example, is Strong Light of Day, one of the Caitlin Strong, my female Texas Ranger series. In Strong Light of Day, I couldn't understand some of the reasons the villain did the things he did. And I didn't realize why until literally after I had finished the book, and I went, oh, my God. Now I get it. And I had to go back and make some changes. But it's almost, Dr. Joe, like my subconscious had figured it out before my conscious mind did, and my conscious mind had to catch up.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. The idea that you suddenly have to sleep on it, get an epiphany, reminds me of it's a science story, but a real story about this guy Kukuli who was faced with a problem about carbon rings. It doesn't really matter, but he once had a dream of 6 snakes biting each other in a circle with their tails, and he realized that was the structure of the benzene ring. I know it may seem completely off base, but it is the same process. We have these remarkable abilities to integrate information when we're not awake, when we're not even thinking about it. That is really fascinating. I love writing as well, and I find that I wait. I don't feel that there's anything in there to write, and then suddenly it's there, and it just sort of all comes out at the same time. It's like one page after the other. Is that your process as well, that there's nothing there for a while and suddenly there's something, or not because you're a professional?
No. I'm pretty much when I'm working regularly, which is most of the time, I'm turning out 3,000 words a day.
Wow.
And there are some days where it's less just because I have other things I have to do, other demands on my time. But essentially, when I think about what I do, I'm writing. If one of the great gifts, if you can remember when you were young enough, and when your grandfather, your father, your grandmother, your mother was sitting at your bedside, reading you a bedtime story, and how you didn't want to fall asleep because you wanted to get to the end, even though you'd probably already heard it 1,000 times. I think the great thing about entertainment, pop culture, is when it makes us feel like kids again. Another movie I saw as a young kid was the original Jason and the Argonauts.
Yep.
In those days, there was no CGI. It was Ray Harryhauser stop-motion animation. But in that movie, when the Colossus of Rhodes, the giant statue, steps down from the pedestal and starts fighting with the Argonauts and Jason, it's like, oh, my God, I had never seen anything like that. I felt exactly the same way 55 years later, when I watched the episode, The Long Night, episode 3 of the final season of Game of Thrones. I felt like a little kid again watching the Colossus of Rhodes step down off the pedestal. And the greatest gift a writer can give a reader is to make them feel like a kid again.
Yeah. It's so true. There's something about reading a book and you just absorbed and taken right back.
Well, what is that? Is it the innocence of it? Is it the feeling of nostalgia? Is it? I
think it's simpler than that. I think when you're writing, I write from my imagination, from my subconscious. I see it, I put it down. That's what the reader is interpreting. The imagination doesn't age. The subconscious doesn't age. The conscious mind ages. But the imagination never really ages. You can imagine different things. But we always exist based on what we can envision and how we, what we can see in our minds. And I think the greatest writers are able to speak to that part of us that never ages, the imagination. Mm-hmm. And this is what I mean when I say get out of your way as a writer and let the story be the story. So it can make us feel as we're reading it the same way we felt when someone was reading us a bedtime story or telling us a bedtime story. That is the gift of entertainment, of film, of books, of TV, of music, of any stage plays for some people. Escapism. That's why people in this, especially this crazy world, and I can tell you this. Here's something that I always say the greatest gift a writer can do is to give someone who's in the hospital or stuck on an airplane for 13 hours and is to take them into my world. Well, I've had plenty of experiences where you get. I've had disappointments. I've had rejection. I've had books that haven't sold or sold as well. But as soon as I'm behind the computer and I'm writing, I'm into a book. Once I start, all that goes away, because I get into the world of my story that I'm writing in the same way I want a reader to get into it when they're reading.
Yeah. Well, I can totally relate to that, and what I'm really hoping is that people who are listening, our listeners, can get into the world of our sponsors, because they also have a story to tell. We will listen to their story, but then we're going to come back with Jon Land to talk about writing. It is wonderful. We'll be right back with the Dr. Joe Show.
Stretch the canvas, brush it